Anna Schaffner, thank you so much for coming on. Um, Anna, I love your book. We bought a copy, um, and it was really insightful because it wasn't what I expected. It was it is a wonderful multidisciplinary exploration of why we get burnt out and solutions to tackle that. I want to Before we get into it, I want to know how you came to sort of have this niche of a burnout coach.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question, Ben. So I think it was a combination of personal experiences, so I've always, struggled with exhaustion and lack of energy and, all the associated symptoms. And I was also just really curious about it from a cultural historical point of view. So, um, in Germany, people always talk about, the age of exhaustion. We're all so burned out, and I think Germany was a bit ahead of the curve in that they've started to talk about this about 10 years ago. And every time I went home, I saw very alarmist newspaper articles about, like how we're living in the most exhausting times ever. And as a cultural historian, I became really curious about that. And I wondered, are our times really the most exhausting times ever? Have people struggled with this topic in other historical periods? And if yes, how and why, and how did they theorize their exhaustion? What kind of stories did they develop around it? What metaphors did they come up with? And then I started to research the topic and found that, in fact, our struggles with exhaustion are not at all unique, and people have always felt exhausted throughout history, and they've written about it, and they've tried to look for cures and counsel. And then I became really drawn into this topic. And it's also, I think, an exciting topic for me because it's a threshold topic. You mentioned it's an interdisciplinary book, and it's about the mind and the body and the social and, culture and how they interact. So I think exhaustion is one of those phenomena that is really, you know, bleeding into all of these different domains. We need to understand psychology, we need to understand our physiology, we also need to understand the broader cultural causes of exhaustion. And as someone who's always worked in an interdisciplinary way, that was the perfect topic for me. And then because I had written those books, and also struggled with this, it sort of, when I went into coaching, it became my natural niche, and I, started to attract fellow exhausted academics and also people from lots and lots of different domains as well. And it's a wonderful field to work in because it's also so ubiquitous. So many of us struggle with exhaustion these days.
Well, the market must be. I mean, it's a pretty large market. Sadly, I mean, a lovely opportunity for you to
Mm.
add a lot of value to people's lives, but it seems like we're all more burnt out than ever. Um, and actually, another thing I loved about your book is they were all tools, well, interdisciplinary tools to solving burnout, but they seem sort of interdisciplinary tools just for actually living well. Which you go back to the
Yeah.
old root of what philosophy is meant to be. It's a guide to living well. So it was more philosophical than I thought, and I really enjoyed that. Um, I just want to get into I want to get into a David Foster Wallace quote you have in the book,
Yeah.
um, which says your goal for the book was to hope to see the water in which we all swim. That makes us also very tired.
Yeah.
Is is it the water in which we're in, or is it part of the human condition? Because the water's always changed,
Yeah.
right? From an ancient problem to the water now, or is it just innate part of the human condition?
I would say it's both and. So exhaustion is a timeless phenomenon. All ages, all cultures, all people have struggled with it, have struggled with exhaustion. Um, but it is also cultural specific. So I'm going to give you this very academic both and answer.
Please do.
I do think that, it's part of what makes us human, because our energies wane as we age. We worry about the loss of energy. We fear its symptoms. We fear its effects on our bodies. It's related to losing interest in the world losing strength, becoming weak. So it hooks into some of our darker fears, around our mental, psychological engagement and our physiological capabilities. And exhaustion has always been around. Um, but people come up with very different stories about what causes it. And then there's the cultural water in which we swim right now. And I do think that we do live in challenging times. I do think that there are a few issues that are very unique to our age. So, first point is, of course, technology. So, we have to struggle with very invasive, very distracting, very ubiquitous technology that destroys our concentration, that constantly claims our attention, that costs us a lot of energy. Like, interestingly, technology was designed to save us time and energy, but I do think ultimately, if we look at it more objectively speaking, we see it comes at a huge cost. So we battle with that. The constant distraction by the attention economy. And then we also live in an age where we overvalue work. And I think, again, as a historian, I would say that's very specific to our times, that we expect work to deliver so much in our lives. And that hasn't been the case, historically speaking. I think, we expect not just a salary and status from our work, but we expect work to deliver meaning, to deliver belonging, to deliver identity, purpose, really some kind of existential justification for who we are and why we are on the planet. So I would say work nowadays is massively overdetermined. When we encounter someone for the first time, we say, "What do you do?" And it's basically means, "Who are you?" And I think that's quite unique. And that also means that when we suffer at work, that suffering really pervades into all domains of our lives. It really captures our whole being, because work, it has such a central, important status in our society and also in our mental lives. Um, so I would say that's quite unique to the moment in which we are.
Yeah, I that really resonates. I think everyone, growing up, the advices are do what, find your passion, find
Yeah,
your passion, do what you're passionate about. And the reality is, people are just unsatisfied with their jobs because they're expecting to find passion and meaning and, their whole reason for being in their work. And then inevitably, when they don't find that, they feel like they're a disappointment, and this vast gap, which I think you talk about in your book, between expectations and dreams versus the actual
yeah,
present day reality of it.
yeah,
And I think,
absolutely.
yeah, I think passion should be replaced with, keen interest, obsessive interest. Do something you're interested in. Um, so with regards to the passion side of the equation, why do you think we put so much emphasis on work?
Um, I think, yeah, I mean, the passion piece is interesting, right? Ideally, we want to do what we love, what gives us meaning, what makes us feel alive and fulfilled. But often we find that the reality is totally different from what we had imagined we could do, and then we, obviously struggle with economic realities, with the kind of lack of resources, with competition everywhere. So often this kind of do what you love mantra, on which we all grew up, and especially millennials, I think, have really internalized this. Your job has to be your passion. You have to do what you love, and often that just doesn't work, because sometimes it doesn't generate income. Sometimes doing what we love can be incredibly draining, especially people who are in the caring professions. People are very idealistic about their work, like carers, not nurses, teachers, um, counselors, therapists, coaches. That it can at some level, when they are confronted with this gap between their ideal and then the reality of their work, that can really breed enormous disappointment and even bitterness and burnout. But coming back, what was the second part of your question, Ben?
Oh, I mean, that I think you answered it. To be honest, it was yeah, it was more just like, why is that a problem? Why we have so much emphasis
Yeah,
on our work, and yeah, more in the way of I'm leading to. I want to know what causes burnout. You know, what are the leading causes of burnout? And it
yeah.
seems this mismatch of work is one of them, at least. But maybe we'll go there. What are the causes of burnout?
Yeah, so coming back to why work is so central right now, I think that again there are historical reasons for that because I think with the kind of Calvinist Protestant Reformation, people put more emphasis on work. If you were successful in your profession, that was deemed to be a sign of being amongst the elect, that was deemed to be a sign of being chosen. So worldly success became, in a very convoluted, twisted way, it became proof that you were amongst those predestined for salvation in the afterlife. So um, Max Weber, this German sociologist, talked about the Protestant work ethic and this merging of, religious beliefs with capitalist behaviors. And I do think this inheritance has only gotten stronger. This expectation of work to furnish us with almost a form of salvation. So that's one of the reasons why work is so overdetermined. And I do also think that work has become a key you know a key nexus where we get connection, where we get confirmation of our value, of our identity, and so on. And then we also live in very competitive times, so work is also an existential financial struggle for many. um, but what causes burnout? Yes, I think I would say an overdetermination of work and us having a really, really, really high horizon of expectation regarding work. And then I would say classic reasons for what causes burnout is if we have no proper work-life boundaries, and technology makes that incredibly difficult because many of us now work from home. Many of us use our working devices for pleasure as well. So our phones, our laptops, they are instruments and tools, but they also provide us with entertainment. So it's very hard to draw the boundary there. Um, and then I would say because we're permanently reachable, we find it ever harder to put proper boundaries into place to say, okay, this is when I stop working. I will not be reachable. I let my mind recover. I let my thoughts detach from work because technology bleeds into our life. We're perpetually reachable. That has become a massive problem. Um, for many, many people, I know almost all of my clients struggle with that. And then you can also have cultures, working cultures. You can be in working cultures where it's expected that you're reachable, right? It's very hard if you're the lone rebel who says, no, I'm not going to answer emails after 5 p.m. and everybody else does. That's difficult. If then you will be singled out as someone who's not committed, who's not serious or whatever. So working cultures matter as well. It needs to be a collective effort. If we are the only ones practicing certain things, we might actually um, feel ourselves getting disadvantaged for that. So it has to be an agreement in the workplace. Like we are all going to commit to work-life boundaries. We're going to commit to not sending emails after 8. We're going to commit to only contacting each other in cases of genuine emergency and so on. So you need some form of collective agreement in the workplace. And classic reasons for burnout are also, there are structural ones and internal ones. So let's start with the structural ones. The structural ones would be toxic working environments, where you have not enough resources and too many demands. So at a very simple level, burnout is an imbalance between resources and demands. So if your workloads are too high, if your time pressures are too intense, if expectations are too high, then and you have a limited amount of time, then inevitably at some point there will be an imbalance and you'll get overwhelmed and stressed. Um, and then bad bosses, I had to say it, are a massive, massive feature in the kind of burnout landscape. There's been a very troubling study that came out a couple of months ago about, like 80% of bosses in the UK are accidental managers, right? They have never been properly trained how to manage people, how to lead teams, how to support others, and that shows. In academia, that's a massive problem, and because people get into leadership roles without any formal training, without any support, any guidance on how to be a good leader, and then they're responsible for people's work well-being, and they don't have the training and they don't have the capacity, and that's a massive problem. So toxic working environments, bad bosses, not enough resources, and I would say lack of appreciation is massive. I see that in most of my clients. They feel undervalued. They feel they don't get support, appreciation. They don't get praise. They don't get positive feedback at work. And that really matters, because we talked about how work
Mm.
is so overdetermined. And if you then feel like, what I do doesn't matter or it's not appreciated in any way, it's like being in a bad relationship. It's like having an unloving partner. It's awful. And when you don't when you don't get that kind of affirmation that you need to thrive. So these would be the structural causes for burnout. And then internal causes can be perfectionism. There's often a correlation between people having very, very high standards for themselves, setting very high standards and having very high expectations of their own work. Perfectionist tendencies can be good for us, right? They're usually rewarded, and they can also drive us. They can be very positive, but they can also become counterproductive. They can become maladaptive if we start to procrastinate or just constantly put ourselves down and hate what we produce because it's not perfect enough in our eyes. And I would say an inner critic, an overactive inner critic. So when we suffer from negative self-talk, negative automatic thoughts and self stories, when we put ourselves down and we focus only on our perceived shortcomings, failures, and we tell ourselves bad stuff about ourselves all the time, and that can really drain our energy from within.
So all of those, I want to double click on a lot of them because they're super interesting,
Yeah.
and I think a lot of us can relate to a few or one or a whole spectrum. Hopefully not. But how do people know? For the listener, how do you know if you are burnt out? How do
Yeah.
you know if you're not just a bit tired, or if you're actually suffering from proper burnout? How do you know?
So there are three classic symptoms. And the first one is chronic exhaustion, chronic fatigue that doesn't get better when you rest. So it's not just like, oh, I'm so tired, I need a week off, I need a weekend off, and then I'll feel better again. It's a kind of tiredness that you cannot seem to shake off, even if you do rest, even if you do take time off. It's become really chronic. So chronic exhaustion is symptom number one. Second symptom is what psychologists call depersonalization. And that's a term that describes a kind of bitterness. When we start to feel bitter and cynical about the people with whom we work, it can be colleagues, can be our bosses, it can be our clients. Um, and we become, we suddenly lose our care, we lose our warmth with these people, and we can only see negatives, and we feel very, very bitter and yeah, cynical and detached, alienated from our environment. That's actually a symptom that not a lot of people talk about because it's not very attractive, right? It's one of those symptoms that not many people own freely. Like we can all say, "Oh, I'm feeling very, very tired," but I'm feeling really bitter is actually one that is harder to embrace. It's also one that you don't tend to notice until you actually stop feeling bitter because it's become your reality, right? It's like you just see how bad everything is, how horrible everyone acts, and how annoying everyone is. You become very, very irritable. So I would say irritability and bitterness is a sign, being short fused, like you become angry because you just don't have any resources left, and everything gets to you. You have zero defenses, everything gets to you. And a third key symptom, in addition to chronic exhaustion and irritability, bitterness, is less you become less productive, you become less effective, less efficient, you lose your ability to stay on top of your workload. So not everyone suffers that. So I have a lot of clients who, I would say, burn on. They manage to work, often manage to work quite well. People wouldn't notice that they're even burned out, but they actually, it comes at a really high cost, so they're functioning at work, but then they completely collapse at home, and their lives become very empty, and their bodies begin to really suffer, their mental health begins to suffer, but they still manage to work. Some people can't work anymore, and that's often when burnout becomes more visible, when you cannot stay on top of your workload, everything becomes overwhelming, you just don't manage to keep up anymore. And then often that comes with anxiety, because it's very threatening when you go from high functioning, because burnout, people who suffer from burnout are often very high functioning people, high achievers, people who are very successful at work, very conscientious, very caring. When they suddenly can't function anymore, that becomes very anxiety inducing, very threatening to their sense of self. So these are the core three symptoms.
Okay, it's really interesting because that it doesn't sound like you're not selling it to me, right? I don't want these
Yeah.
symptoms. I don't think anyone else does. What group of people is most susceptible to perhaps getting burnt out? I mean, when you mentioned
Mm,
perfectionists, right? And in my
yeah.
head, I can see how that would be this very uh, quite hard ideal to live up to all the time. In your experience, what group is most susceptible?
Yeah. So so technically, I think when burnout was first diagnosed, that was in the 1970s, and it was diagnosed amongst people in the caring professions. So people who are helper figures, psychologists, counselors, social workers, nurses, teachers. And the reason why it came up in those circles first, or was observed first in those kinds of professions, is because they are very idealistic, right? They're driven by the desire to help, and ideals about what they wanted to change. They wanted to be impactful, they wanted to be helpful, and when they noticed that the structures in which they were working weren't helpful, they didn't have the resources, they didn't have the power, they didn't have the support to do what they really wanted to do, then that gap between ideal and reality that we talked about before became bigger. So people who are very caring, people in caring professions, were really the first in which we in which burnout was noticed. But nowadays, we can notice burnout in any profession, so it can affect everyone. But I would say, in my experience, it's people who are high achievers, people who really care either about other people or about, like, it can be about their teams as well. It can be about their reputation. People who are deeply concerned with the quality of their work. So I would say people who are very conscientious, high on conscientiousness, um, people who are often helper figures, who don't want to burden their colleagues, who actually take on more than they can carry. I notice that a lot. People who actually want to help others, and they say yes and yes and yes to too many things. People who are perfectionists, we talked about that. So perfectionists, definitely. And I would say also people who have very harsh inner critics. So people who tend to judge themselves very harshly. And that adds to the whole kind of external pressure and the workload. But then they also don't do themselves any favors, because they become very frustrated with themselves, and they only focus on their perceived flaws and failures, and that then drains their energy from within. So they kind of lacking in self-compassion, I would say.
I think when you talk about the inner critic, and I think I really enjoyed reading that part in your book. It's something I've thought about a reasonable amount, and I think you have two types of people when you say a phrase to them. That you have the people who completely get it, and you get the people who look at you like you've said something completely insane. So,
Mm.
with the phrase "you are not your thoughts,"
Mm.
how do you think
Yeah.
about that, and how do you think that relates to the inner critic and burnout?
Yeah. Yeah, Ben, that's one of my favorite one of my favorite sentences. You are not your thoughts. Because that idea is really an ancient idea that has been, developed probably most strongly in Asian philosophies and theologies. And it's the idea that we can observe our thoughts, we can detach from our thoughts, we can look at our thoughts impartially. We don't have to fuse with them. So in Asian frameworks, people would do that via meditation, and I'm sure quite a lot of your listeners have experience with meditation, where where you kind of think of your mind as the blue sky and your thoughts as clouds, as weather, rain, thunderstorms that pass by. They're transient. They're not the real you. The real you is the kind of canvas, and you can watch your thoughts drifting past like white clouds. And but the idea of you are not your thoughts is also really important in modern therapeutic frameworks such as acceptance and commitment therapy, where a huge part is to what they call defuse from your thoughts. So rather than thinking, I'm really useless as my job. I'm a worthless person. I'm not lovable. I mess everything up, right? When we think like that, we are fused with those thoughts. We actually think they're real. We take them as the reality, but they're not the reality. It's something that we're telling ourselves. It's a story. It's a self story, right? It's a judgmental self story. And when we try to defuse from our thoughts, and we take these as thoughts, not as the reality, we can say things like, um, I note that I am thinking that I am worthless at my job. I note that, right? So you observe that you're having this thought. You are not that thought, but you observe yourself having that thought. And you can go even further with this kind of distancing motion. It's like I note that I am noting that I'm having this thought, right? So you kind of you really start to put distance between yourself and that thought. And that can be hugely curative, because I think there's nothing worse than believing our own bad thoughts about ourselves, right? If you tell yourself, I'm not lovable, I don't have any friends, I look horrible, nobody likes me, I'm really crap at my job. If you believe that, then that's your reality. And then
Mm.
these thoughts actually produce emotions, very negative emotions. And if we can manage to actually say, hey, that's not real. These are negative thoughts I'm having. These are negative stories I'm telling myself about myself. That's hugely curative, and that's partly what cognitive behavioral therapy does for you, and acceptance and commitment therapy does it in a, I think, even more powerful and useful way, and an easy to apply way. So yeah, that's that idea. It's a very soothing idea when we're having negative thoughts, to identify them as just negative thoughts, not our reality.
Yeah, I think it's quite a big paradigm shift, that idea. I think once you internalize it and spend a lot of time with it, and however you get there, I don't know, but I think it's one of the things, once you grasp it, you don't quite see everything the same way.
Yeah,
Often I find, conversations, people would talk, their inner critic is way more harsh than they would ever speak to anyone else,
yeah.
but yet they speak really, really harshly to themselves. You probably know the quote, but I can't remember who said it, but enlightenment is the space between you and your thoughts,
Hmm.
right? And
Yeah,
I don't know who said it, but I often think about increasing that space, right? So you sit as the observer more, as opposed to being sort of
yeah,
in the fog with it. But it's quite hard to do. So
yeah.
where do you start with clients coming to work with you? How do you start to get them to maybe that point, or actually, where do you start?
Yeah, where I would start is usually so when clients who come to me because of negative self-talk and harsh critics and overdrive, we would first of all establish the pattern, right? What thoughts do you keep having? Because it's usually one particular accusation, one negative judgment, one core belief that keeps coming up in different ways, right? So it's usually something along the lines of, I'm stupid, I'm ugly, I'm not lovable, I'm bad, I'm really different from everybody else. So most of our negative thoughts revolve around these core complexes. And so what I try to do with my clients first is to establish, okay, what are the thoughts that you keep telling yourself that keep coming up? And then so we establish a pattern. We write them down. We establish what they are, and then what I instruct them to do is to notice them, just to notice them, and to actually note them with awareness and to increase that distance that we talked about. So, say your thought is, I'm unlovable, no one can like me, I don't have any friends, right? You would say, I notice I'm having the thought that I'm unlikable. I noticed that. I just noticed that. And then you can also name that story, which is really powerful. It's like, here comes the I'm not lovable story again. I notice I'm telling myself the I'm not lovable story. And you can also come up with a name for your inner critic, and that can be really powerful. It's like, this inner critic is talking again, this gremlin, this monster in the cave, or whatever you want to call your inner critic. You say, oh, I noticed this, my inner critic is talking, is telling me that old story again. And then you can say, noticing it, okay, I hear it, but I'm not going to buy into it. I'm not going to get fused with it. I'm not going to accept it as the truth. I just notice that this is in my head right now, but I'm going to try and let it pass without attaching myself too much to it. There's a lovely quotation by an Asian sage, and he says, invite your thoughts in, be hospitable to them, but don't serve them tea. And I really like that, because it's the idea of, like, if you serve your inner critic tea, that he or she or it will sort of stay and settle, and if you just kind of, you let them in and then you let them out again, that's kind of something we can hope to do, because we can't get rid of our inner critic. That's the bad news. We cannot just get rid of our inner critic forever, but we can disempower the inner critic. We can learn techniques to observe the inner critic and to say, this is not real. This is the inner critic talking right now. That's why I'm feeling so bad.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that really resonates, especially the not giving it tea part. You don't want to get them all
Yeah.
caffeinated and, give them more airtime and let them go on a tangent at all. I've often believed in reframing of negative thoughts. It's
Hmm.
almost like a counter punch, right? So if you recognize a negative thought as a particular punch, you have to counter with another punch back. Or at least in my head, that seems to be an okay framework, right? But I
Yeah.
think the key here seems to be awareness of it, and so
Yeah.
fostering that
Yeah.
awareness of these negative thoughts or self-limiting thoughts or whatever that is. I want to shift to I guess loss aversion as a
Mm.
very unsexy term, but maybe I'll frame it with a line from the book, which is living safely is dangerous.
Mm. Yeah.
What's the cost of living safely?
Yeah, it's a beautiful quote by Irvin Yalom, and I think that one really resonates with me, because we often think that staying in a really bad situation is kind of the safe option for us, but it isn't, because I mean, it depends on individual circumstances and context, of course, but when we are in a job that really makes us suffer, and that has caused us distress and psychological suffering, loss of self-esteem, loss of mental and physical well-being for a long time, it's not particularly safe to stay in that situation, because staying comes at a cost, and the cost would be that your health deteriorates further. The cost would be that your self-esteem um, becomes ever more damaged. The cost would be that you deprive yourself of the opportunity for a more fulfilling and meaningful activity that is your professional activity. The cost would be that your relationships suffer. The cost could be that you become ill, because you're chronically stressed, you're chronically unhappy. The cost is often physical. Quite a lot of my burned out clients, their bodies actually said no. Their bodies said, no, we've had enough. You have to stop. You have to stop. So the body forces that stop by stopping to function. And that's when we don't allow ourselves to stop, when we don't allow ourselves to, look at alternative options. Sometimes the body steps in and just breaks down and says, no, I'm forcing you to do something now about this situation. And that's threatening, and that's upsetting, and it's not a nice place to be in. But it also comes with huge opportunities, because people then rebuild their lives, and they rebuild it cautiously and deliberately, and they rebuild it more in line with what they truly want and need. And often, the kind of post burnout, that's the good news. The post burnout chapter is often a really good one, because people have learned very precious lessons about what they don't want anymore and what they want instead, and how they can make that happen. And they take much better care of themselves, and they actually know how dangerous it is to not have proper work-life boundaries, and therefore become quite good at enforcing these boundaries. So often the post-burnout chapter can be a very fulfilling and healthy and seductive and appealing one.
How do you help people know what they want?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because that's when we're in the midst of burnout, we don't know that anymore. We just know what we don't want, and um, that's not a good place to be in if we want to take positive action, right? As psychologists know that you have to have a moving towards goal. You have to have a very seductive, powerful vision of what you want instead. Your subconscious mind needs to be on board. It needs to know where it wants to go instead. Otherwise, it won't move. It won't let you do anything. So you have to have that moving towards goal. You have to have that dream vision of what you want instead. So we often start very small. We start with, like, what would a good day look like to you? And we gradually try to build up this muscle, this, like, what do you need, what do you want muscle. And it's actually, it's a really it's a difficult process, because we become so used to repressing our needs and our wants, and become so disconnected from what gives us joy, that we often don't know what that is. And it takes serious work to reconnect with that. Like, when did I last feel alive? What did used to make me happy? What used to bring me joy? And we just gradually rebuild that, connection muscle that can tell us what we truly want, what we long for, and what we need.
I think belief is a big one here. It seems.
Yeah.
I think if you've been squashed and burnt out and feel repressed, I think believing that the world is a lot more plastic than it seems to be, um, might seems like a first step towards the other stuff. How do you go about fostering that? I guess hope that something new is possible, or something different is
Mm.
possible, or you're not your self-limiting beliefs. I mean, it seems like quite a hard conundrum to work through. Like, how would you start with a client there?
Yeah, it's a great question, because okay, I would say that the clients who come to me have hope, because otherwise they wouldn't
Oh
come
yeah.
to me. So there's already, already a kind of self-selecting process. I think people engage in coaching only when they feel like there's hope for change, right? Um, they they have often hit rock bottom. They often are at a place where they say, this cannot continue. I cannot continue. I really have nothing left in the tank, my battery is empty, I don't want to live like that anymore. So that can be a motivator in its own right, when you really feel like this has to change, I cannot continue like this. um, and then I think the hope for a better life is, that's what we work on in the sessions, right? It's like, it's about trying to reconnect clients with their resourceful states, with reminding them of how they used to feel, because they used to be in a better place at some point in their lives. So it's about kind of, remember when you did this, remember when you felt like that, what did it feel like? And you then take it from there. And then you also just, do quite a lot of, pay attention to your feelings, start feeling something again, because often when we're very burned out, we're very much in a headspace, and we are not very well connected to our feelings, because that would be quite scary, because we we would feel all the stuff we're trying not to feel by overworking, and by not engaging with what's going on in our bodies. So that's a gradual process. But I think, you know getting clients to connect with what they want, and what a good life would look like, and what a good day would look like, and what, even just what makes you feel relaxed. How do you relax? And starting very small and then building it up is kind of the process.
I like in the book, there's so many different tools or mental models or mental frameworks, whatever you want to call them, but I think they're all really powerful. What would you say is um, the most underutilized, the less
Hmm.
obvious one that you think is so potent but doesn't get enough airtime in the book?
Hmm. Yeah, great question, man. So we talked about you are not your thoughts, right? And this kind of creating gaps between what you think and then how you react to that. Um, I would say the Stoic circle of control is a really powerful model. It's quite well known though, so it's I think a lot of people use it already, but it's hard to practice. It's a well-known tool, but I think putting it into action is far from simple. And it's the idea that we focus our attention on what we can control. We focus our attention, our effort, our emotional resources on what we can control, and we try and become more accepting of what we cannot control. And that sounds very simple, but it's really hard to practice, because I think we spend a lot of time worrying about stuff that is beyond our control. And the Stoics, the ancient Greek Stoic philosophers, actually were very radical about what is in our control and what is not in our control. And they said that the only thing we can truly control is our judgments, our beliefs, our thoughts, and our reactions. Everything external is totally beyond our control. And so they said we should only focus our attention on how we react, how we judge situations, and how we make ourselves feel with our thoughts and our beliefs and our judgments. So, and I would say there is middle ground. There are some externals that we have some control over to a certain degree, and nor is it so easy to control how we think and how we react. But it's a very great model that helps when we're very, very stressed, just to say, okay, what are our core stressors? Let's make a list of what our core stressors are, and then to put them into two circles. One, I can control these stressors. Two, these are the stressors that are beyond my control. And then really try and focus on what we can control and become more accepting about the uncontrollables. And another great model is the 80-20 rule. I think that's actually, I'm not sure, I don't think I discussed that one in the book. But the 80-20 rule is, or it's also known as the Pareto law, or the law of least effort. And it states that 20% of our efforts lead to 80% of our successes. In other words, 80% of what we do is stuff that isn't very effective, that doesn't contribute to our most important outcomes and successes. So looking at how we work, what we do on a daily basis, um, in a very analytical and clear-cut way can also be a really helpful exercise. What don't we need to do anymore? What parts of what we do on a daily basis is not helpful? It's not generating the results that we want to have. And people make that, people apply that law in teams and organizations. It also applies to economies at large. But if we look at our own lives, through that 80-20 framework, like which of my activities actually really matter? What part of what I do is responsible for my core successes or is responsible for what is important to me? And which of my activities are kind of a waste of my time. And of course, sometimes we cannot decide very freely what we do if we're in a very kind of restrictive working environment where that is dictated to us. We cannot make these choices, but where we can make these choices, an exercise well worth doing.
I think they're models that I put in the category. They're really simple but quite hard to take seriously. And I
Yeah,
think you unlock them when you take them seriously and really try and internalize them.
yeah,
Um, Going back to the sort of dichotomy of control one, the I feel like again it goes back to reframing, and how much of this is reframing. Rather than I want to win the tennis match, it's I'm just going to try and play my best today. So
yeah,
suddenly you bring something external into your control, right? And it's just a simple mental reframe. So you mentioned the 80-20 principle. We spoke about the sort of the dichotomy of control.
mm,
I'd love to get into my favorite chapter in the book, which is joy. And I think it was my favorite because
yeah.
of the lack of purpose behind it, or lack of pursuit behind it. There was no end goal as opposed to just doing it for the sake of it. Can you speak to joy and how maybe we've sort of lost hobbies for the sake of hobbies in our world?
Yeah. Yeah, that's it's great to hear that was your favorite chapter. It's one of mine as well. I think one of the things I observe in my clients all the time is that when we start to um slip into burnout territory, when we become very tired and exhausted and we feel like we don't have any energy, we don't have any resources left, we cut things down, right? We cut stuff out of our life. We stop doing this, that, and the other, and often we end up just working, right? Because we literally don't have the energy for anything else. We stop seeing friends, we stop exercising, we stop going to concerts, we stop going for walks in nature because all of that costs us energy that we don't have. But that's the vicious circle, because when we stop all the things that give us joy, when we stop doing all the things that energize us and that give us meaning and purpose and connection, then our burnout will only get worse. We do need to have sources of joy and energy in our lives, and often that's precisely what we cut out when we burn out. And that's incredibly dangerous because we end up just doing the activities that cost us energy and not having any of the activities in our lives that give us energy. Now, I'm a huge fan of having a hobby, and hobby is not a very fashionable word, but I think the way I understand it is it's something we do just for pleasure. Yeah, we don't need to be fabulous at it. We don't need to compete at it. We don't need to share it with anyone, even. We just do it because it makes us feel good. We just do it because it gives us a sense of well being, a sense of maybe even a flow state. We just love doing it for the purpose of doing it. It has no other function. It cannot be put to work for anything. It's just an activity that we do because we love doing it and it makes us feel good. And we have far too little of that in our lives. And I do think it's a really important thing to do when we're recovering from burnout. We need to
Hmm.
bring that back into our lives. We need to reconnect with what makes us feel alive and what just makes us, feel happy and joyous.
It's playful, right? It's people lose sight of that. I think when they get into the corporate world and they lose sight of actually we're here to play and have
Yeah,
fun. What's your hobby? What do you like to do?
yeah. So I do kickboxing, and I'm not particularly good at it, but I just love it.
Hmm.
And it's not that I'm ever going to be able to compete or win fights or anything. It's an activity I do simply because it makes me feel incredibly good and I love doing it. I run as well. And I don't run for speed. I don't measure how far I run, how fast I run. I just run because I love it and I love being out in nature. And I'm not very competitive with myself, even when I run. It's like sometimes I run fast, sometimes I run very slowly, depending on my energy levels. And I also play the piano. And I'm one of those people who really can't perform in front of others. So it's like it's a very private gift. I just play for myself. It's not really shareable, and in a way that makes it also very precious, because it's really literally just for me,
I love that.
just because I love doing it.
That's so nice, refreshing. We were in the car once, and or quite recently, maybe about 2 months ago, and my partner Eloise, producer Eloise, asked me what are you doing at the moment that's just for fun? Just a hobby, just for fun, with no pursuit, no goal attached to it. And it's sort of, I was like, well, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, I'm doing this, and then it's actually no, all those things have clear goals you're trying to get towards. And it really popped this
Yeah,
bubble for me of like, actually, everything in my life has a pursuit towards it, and actually, nothing was just for fun for the sake of it,
yeah,
because I felt unproductive, and it didn't feel like I was trying to strive to anything or it's going to get me to where I want to go. And actually, that's quite a hard knot to untangle. But I feel like it's in the sort of
yeah,
air we breathe, right?
yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
yeah. How
Mm.
do you get that a lot? Is that quite common with your clients?
Yeah, because even exercise, we can say is borderline, right? Because exercising is also healthy. It might make us, it might lead to losing weight. It might lead us to looking better. So it's not one of those kind of completely purposeless activities, if we're really honest about it, unless we really just do it for fun. And I mean, it has these healthy side effects. Some people do it mainly because of these effects, right? So it's a trick. It's really hard actually to find an activity that just gives you pleasure and that you really do without any other secondary gains. And even learning something can be like, oh, that's self-development. That's kind of, that feeds into our desire to grow and so on. So it's really hard to find that, activity just for fun. But we
Hmm.
can watch kids. They're very good at it. Kids are the masters of, doing stuff just for fun and for no ulterior reason. Have you found something, Ben, that you can do just for fun?
I have. Tennis is just for fun. There's no
Ah,
end goal. Obviously, I'd
okay.
like to win. I'm quite competitive, but it's a sort of infinite game, right? I play tennis just for the sake of it, but I'm trying to untrain myself from
Yeah.
having stakes attached to it, or from something I'm trying to pursue. Even even backgammon. I love playing backgammon. It's really fun, and there's no point to
Mm.
it other than play. But I always have to have like, okay, we're betting on who buys lunch or who buys the next ice cream or whatever it is. And I'm trying to untangle that. It's just my personality. But I'm still
Yeah.
working on it. I think I need more of stuff just for fun
Yeah.
and try to untangle this pursuit orientated mindset, which I think is I don't know, maybe
Mm.
upbringing or culture, or I'm not quite sure, but trying to untangle it. Easy said than done, though. With regards to your clients, and you've been coaching for a while. Well, how long have you actually have been coaching for?
Almost 5 years now.
Okay, right, 5
Yeah.
years. So, what surprised you most about the whole coaching experience with your clients? What have you learned from them?
That's a great question. I would say just how many of us are struggling with a mean inner critic. Just how widespread negative self-talk is, and how disabling that is, and how much suffering that causes in the most successful people, in people you would never ever suspect who were suffering from that. How many people feel like imposters? That's another one. No matter whether they're CEOs, multimillionaires, hugely successful academics, like how many of us feel like imposters? This is incredible.
Yeah, there's a nice line by
Yeah.
Ricky Gervais that says there's no adults. You know, everyone's just making it up. And I think that's quite nice to notice
Yeah.
from time. You know, someone at the top of their game, world famous, always like, we're just all making it up.
Mm.
Um, well, look, Anna, I could sit and talk to you all
Yeah.
day. There's so many other things in your book we didn't get into because obviously we can't cover a whole book in an hour, but I would encourage people to go and buy it. I thought it was really interesting. And I think it's one of the you can pick up and as and when and flick through a chapter. I mean, I think you recommend just the chapter a day, right? But um, where can people find you and keep up with your work?
Mm. People can find me on my website. That's akschaffner.com. And I regularly publish blog posts, so they will all be on my website. I also have a newsletter, so people are very welcome to subscribe to my monthly newsletter. And I also, yeah, post on LinkedIn sometimes. So that's where people could find me. I do have a free download for people suffering from exhaustion and burnout. Again, you can find that on my website. It's a kind of 7 steps to overcoming burnout, and it has some very helpful tips in it.
Wonderful. Well, look, thank you so much for coming on. Really enjoyed that.
Well, thank you so much for the conversation. It was a joy.